During Donald Trump's presidency, news media came under attack. But what some of you might not know is that news media was already under attack in the United States and around the world by something much more complex and invisible: the rise of the ad tech industry.
One of the things that made Spotlight so powerful is the knowledge that the newspaper industry today is in big trouble. Papers have been closing and downsizing for years, and that affects all of us. Even if you only get your news from Facebook, Google, Twitter, or Arianna Huffington's Block Quote Junction and Book Excerpt Clearinghouse, those places are often just repackaging the work of newspapers, and it is not just websites. Watch how often TV news ends up citing print sources.
According to the Chicago Tribune.
According to the Detroit Free Press.
According to the San Francisco Chronicle.
According to the Times-Picayune.
The Boston Globe.
The Orlando Sentinel.
The Philadelphia Inquirer.
The Pittsburgh Tribune Review.
The Detroit News.
And the Houston Chronicle reports.
The Los Angeles Times reports. The Oklahoman reports. The Hartford Courant reports. The Salt Lake Tribune reports.
It's pretty obvious, without newspapers around to cite, TV news would just be Wolf Blitzer endlessly batting a ball of yarn around. And it is not just news outlets. Stupid shows like ours lean heavily on local papers. In fact, whenever this show is mistakenly called journalism, it is a slap in the face to the actual journalists whose work we rely on.
You know those annoying ads which pop up on whichever website you are visiting? Those are controlled by the ad tech software or programmatic advertising. Now, understanding how ad tech software works is pretty complex, and we'll get into it at another point. But for now, let's look at how ad tech influences publishers and why policymakers are working hard to protect news publishers from ad tech companies. Now, according to Pew Research, newsroom employment only in the United States decreased by 23% between 2008 and 2019. Now, that is a lot of unemployed journalists. But it's not just journalists. Newsrooms are populated by editors, analysts, photographers, and whatnot. Now, another statistic to look at is that majority of these job losses were after 2014, and they were in the newspaper industry. Combined newsroom employment in the other four news-producing industries, broadcast television, radio, cable, and digital native, remained relatively stable, even rising modestly after 2014. That kind of makes sense though, doesn't it? Because the way we consume news has changed drastically over the last few years. We get majority of our news now from a mobile or laptop. In fact, majority of Americans, up to 86%, consume news online, and the number is similarly rising around the world. News sources have also become highly diversified because of the internet and online technology, so people like me and you can set up programs and say that we are presenting news and facts instead of a few companies holding all access to information. Now, that is a solid argument being made by Facebook and Google that news consumption habits have changed and that news organizations need to evolve their business models in order to keep up with the times. And that is why we see more and more news organizations asking us to subscribe to their content and putting up paywalls so that we can access 2-3 articles at a time and have to pay to see more in a month or a week or whatnot. But let's take a step back and think about the news business model. Up until a decade ago, we were getting majority of our news from TV, radio, or newspapers, right? Also, if we were buying or selling something, ads appeared in the newspaper such as classifieds. So basically, apart from subscriptions, news organizations were making majority of their revenue from ads. So for instance, if you're selling a toaster, right, you'll put an ad in a newspaper so that people learn that you're selling a toaster. But what would you do now? You'd put the ad on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace. Or let's say there's a big brand like Coca-Cola. Their ad would appear in the middle of nightly news hour, right? How it worked was that news and advertisers were more in touch with one another, and they also had editorial control in the news organization so that they could decide what ad appears where. For the last decade though, this process has been taken over by software, and ads are placed automatically through something called real-time bidding. Now, real-time bidding is a very interesting concept, but for now, let's just say that the middleman is now software industry. So if you search for a product online or Googled it, that ad starts popping up all across your website or inside your Facebook feed, and that is being done through this kind of process. Now, here is the most important statistic. According to the World Advertising Research Council, in 2020, Facebook and Google hoovered up over 70% of the $300 billion spent globally on digital advertising. Facebook and Google have majority control over all of the digital advertising supply chain, as they have been buying up companies which serve ads like DoubleClick over the last few years. They are an ad tech global duopoly. Now, this brings up 2 points. One is that the global digital ads market is growing exponentially. In fact, by 2024, the global ad market value is expected to reach $769.9 billion. Other tech players like Amazon and Twitter have also started to inch their way into the advertising technology market. Now let's throw in some more numbers for context. In 2020, Facebook's revenue jumped 20% to roughly $86 billion from $70.7 billion in 2019. In 2020, Google's ad revenue amounted to $146.9 billion US. What is Google and Facebook's business model? It is mostly dependent on ad revenue from ad tech. Why are they so dominant? It's because Google and Facebook have the largest reservoirs of user data and user habits, which incentivizes advertisers to use their services. Or can we say that they are left with no other choice? In response to multiple EU fines and US lawsuits, Google is now claiming that 70% of the ad revenue goes to publishers. But researchers disagree because they find it very difficult to verify this number given the opaque nature of the advertising supply chain and the decreasing publisher revenues. You might ask at this point that if newsroom jobs are stabilizing, then why is this a problem? According to a new PwC Media Outlook report, global newspaper advertising, print and online, will fall from $49.2 billion in 2019 to $36 billion in 2024, a decline of more than a quarter or 27% over a period of 5 years. Global circulation and subscriber revenue is also expected to fall from $58.7 billion in 2019 to $50.4 billion in 2024. So while news revenues are declining, ad tech revenues are increasing. So that is the context within which regulators are coming after Facebook and Google in particular, and lawmakers are citing publishers' revenue as one of the main reasons that they need to be regulated. This is also why recently Facebook decided to pull news linking from its platform in Australia, but after much uproar decided to stay put. And this is also why Google is launching Google News Showcase with an investment of $1 billion over 3 years so that they can start licensing news content with partnerships with over 400 companies already. Now, while regulations and lawsuits are still under debate in many European countries and the United States, Australia is the first country which has actually passed a news revenue sharing law, which we will be discussing on a different episode. But for now, let's use the US as a use case, as the United States is the largest programmatic advertising market in the world, and these companies are based out of here. In 2019, the Journalism Preservation and Competition Act was introduced in Congress. This was in relation to a News Media Alliance report, which is claiming that Facebook and Google made $4.8 billion in revenue from news publishers' content.
Fundamentally, our readership is at its highest levels ever. But while news organizations continue to invest heavily in generating critically valuable reporting, a few dominant companies in the digital ecosystem ensure that little value is returned to publishers. The government cannot regulate the news business under the First Amendment, but there are now 2 companies in particular, Google and Facebook, that clearly do regulate us. Their algorithms determine when and if news is seen in search results and news feeds. They determine how news is presented to readers. They collect and control data about our news audiences, and they control the systems and markets around digital advertising.
This law was reintroduced a couple of weeks back, and it was also introduced in Senate back then with bipartisan support. Journalism Competition and Preservation Act seeks to provide temporary safe harbor from antitrust regulations to enable news publishers to negotiate with big tech companies for a more balanced model for revenue sharing. The European Union is also close to passing the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. These laws could be amended as they pass through the European Union Parliament and include some elements from the Australian law that was recently passed. These include the option of binding arbitration for licensing agreements and requiring tech companies to inform publishers about changes to how they rank stories on their sites, thus giving publishers a heads up if these tech companies change their algorithms so that news stories might not appear in the same area as before. In response to all these regulations, Google and Facebook have upped their attempts to start licensing news content, with Google claiming that it sends users to news websites 24 billion times a month. To dig deeper into today's topic, we'll be talking with our expert Nicco Mele. Nicco is Managing Director at the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation. Nicco was the director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics and Public Policy. To read more of Nicco's thoughts, you can visit his Substack. Nicco, can you tell us how the rise of the ad tech industry has impacted journalism or the news industry?
For almost 150 years, almost all the news was subsidized, was paid for with advertising, mostly print advertising in newspapers. And that, subscription fees for newspapers and what they used to call newsstand fees were a pretty small percentage of overall newspaper and news revenue. The bulk of it was from advertising. And advertising, big chunk of that was actually classified advertising. It's worth noting that for the most part, Craigslist kind of really took away all the classified advertising revenue. And so when news was looking at ad revenue and trying to figure out what to do online, it was a strange world to the news industry. When I say news industry, I mean primarily the newspaper industry, but also television news and radio news too. But the bulk of the news in the United States is produced by the newspaper industry, even to this day. And so the newspaper industry just really wasn't sure how to navigate the digital space. And that created an opportunity for ad tech and third-party providers of software to kind of insert themselves between the audience and the publisher to manage ad sales. And that had a positive impact, I'd say, for advertisers. Famously, there was a Depression-era supermarket magnate called Wanamaker, and he said, half of my advertising works, I just don't know which half. It turns out it's more like 0.0000001% of your advertising works, and you can get just that narrow slice if you're an advertiser, because ad tech can aggregate audiences across multiple websites and multiple publishers and just sell you the tiny slice you want. That's great for advertisers, arguably good for consumers, asterisk some data privacy issues there that are significant. It's generally been pretty terrible for publishers. It's really had a very negative impact on publishers because there's a middleman taking a significant chunk of their revenue and dealing with their advertisers. And so, part of the challenges newspapers face and news publishers face is, on the one side, their primary source of revenue, ad revenue, they've lost those customers. Those customers go to ad tech and demand side platforms now. And on the other end, they've lost their audience because their audience is going to Facebook and Twitter and search. And so they don't control either their audience or their advertisers. And that's created real challenges for the industry.
So in 2019, Representative David Cicilline introduced the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, and the News Media Alliance had released a report which basically talked about how journalism had been impacted by ad tech. So can you talk a little bit about that, about what is News Media Alliance's ask and what are they claiming and what's going on with that?
I think those legislative moves to help the news industry are likely to not really have any significant effect. For newspaper publishers moving towards what we might call walled gardens, like paywalls or subscription models. I said earlier that for 150 years, pretty much all the news was subsidized by advertising. There is no future where that is the case, none. And so newspapers, news organizations have to change their businesses to be subscriber-oriented businesses, to what they call reader revenue. And ad tech is not the problem that's really killing newspapers. The problem killing newspapers is, one, they've lost control of, they don't own their audiences or their advertisers. And two, frankly, Google's cost per click model, the kind of performance-based pricing of advertising combined with the blind auction, the demand side blind auction, that's like a giant anchor bringing all cost of advertising down. It's really commodifying advertising in a certain sense, in a way that I don't think there are clear legislative fixes. Moreover, for the ad tech market, I think that a much bigger challenge for ad tech and for publishers is, recent announcements from people like Apple and Google about the increased control they're going to exert over managing people's data. Google in particular, with its recent announcement around essentially more or less phasing out cookies from Google Chrome, that is really a disaster for most of the ad tech industry. So I guess that doesn't really answer your question, but I think anything we can do to help local publishers is important and we should really look at. But moving the needle ultimately is going to be about transitioning from ad-based businesses to subscription-based businesses, and recognizing that data and algorithms arbitrages down the value of advertising, fundamentally changing the business model. And I don't think there's anything you can do about that. That's not the fault of any single company or industry. That's the nature of the digitization of information.
So that brings me to, I guess, the EU laws and what's happened in Australia, because there is regulation being passed, or at least being discussed in the rest of the world. And a lot of it is about having publishers get paid for the content that is used on these platforms. So can you talk a little bit about what's going on over there, and how does that fit into what you just said?
In the case of Australia and the EU, I remain skeptical. Deeply skeptical that on two fronts. One, that those things will generate any meaningful revenue for news producers. I just don't see the economics working. And two, I don't think it deals with any of the actual underlying issues. The underlying issue is that advertising market has gotten ruthlessly efficient because of the introduction of data. And if your business model is built on advertising, it's just not going to fly. I mean, think about this. Let's say I own a store and I sell, I don't know, tennis shoes. And I go and take an ad in the newspaper or buy an ad on the radio. I don't really know how many people saw the ad. I don't know if the ad, it could be nobody heard it or nobody read it. It's just possible, right? There's no data to track that. Moreover, it's actually more likely that a lot of people saw the ad or heard the ad, but they're not the people I'm trying to sell tennis shoes to. They're people who don't play tennis or what have you, right? And the very nature of the internet, the way data works on the internet, has just changed that equation. It's brought ruthless efficiency to the advertising market, and you will not be able to claw back the value of advertising. And so that means that that news companies have to be in a different sort of business, something much more akin to, I'd say, the cable news business in the US, where there's a combination of carriage fees and advertising, but ultimately the carriage fees are the really important part.
So that said, there's a lot of talk in Congress and Senate about passing antitrust and big tech regulation. And I think the publisher aspect is a huge part of it. So do you think the US is going to follow EU or Australia's lead and pass laws which will ask these companies to pay for news? or pass laws which make them have to pay snippet taxes, something like that, what shows up on Google at the top, which Spain, I think, tried a while back, and then Google pulled out. So do you think any of that is going to happen, or what can we expect from all this big talk that is going on in DC right now?
So I think a lot of the talk in DC is, it's hard to say where it will all land, but I would say there are two big problems that are clear to everyone across the political spectrum. The first is the problem of misinformation on platforms, and there doesn't appear to be a good solution. But finding ways to incentivize quality information would be smart, and so I expect to see some policy solutions out there towards that. You know, the US government did this 100 plus years ago, where it basically provided a postal subsidy to magazines and newspapers to try and encourage quality information to be delivered to US households. And so trying to figure out how to combat misinformation with both some regulation to create more accountability, so you can't just say or do anything you want on these platforms, combined with some, you might say, carrot to go with the stick, some incentive towards quality information online to balance out the misinformation. The other big problem that I think everyone across the political spectrum in DC understands is that monopolies discourage innovation and are bad for the consumer. This is not necessarily about news, right? I mean, it's about machine learning, artificial intelligence, robots, drones, you name it. But that big companies can buy patents and squash upstart competitors in ways that are anti-competitive and bad for consumers. And if I had to guess, that is the problem that regulators and legislators are really going to try and tackle, because it's a much easier problem to tackle, in a sense, than the problem of misinformation and the quality of information online.
All right, great. Thank you, Nicco, for taking time out and talking to us.
Anytime, my pleasure.
Did you know that as programmatic and display advertising grows, and as news publishers become more and more dependent on this dominant form of online advertising, ad fraud is also on the rise? While ad fraud has existed since the beginning of the internet, today advertisers lose an estimated $8.2 billion to ad fraud every year, while publishers lose an estimated $1.27 billion annually. Both, in turn, have suffered a crisis of trust with their customers and stakeholders. And one of the reasons that, in spite of this large-scale theft, the ad tech industry is still not being regulated is because it is a highly complex supply chain to understand. Here is a short explainer courtesy of Aspen Tech Policy Hub to get you started.